So Dr. Scott Zengel is a vice president and environmental scientist with Research Planning, Inc., or RPI, based in Tallahassee, Florida. He has been a member of NOAA's scientific support team for over 15 years and often serves as a shoreline cleanup assessment coordinator during oil spill response. On the research front, he was a principal investigator for marsh faunal studies under the Deepwater Horizon NERDA injury assessment and is a co-PI on a current Montgomery research grant with Nichols State University, working on synthesis of coastal marsh impacts and recovery following oil spills. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome back, everybody, from lunch. This is kind of a hard spot, so hopefully we can keep you awake. So I'm going to talk about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and I'm going to focus on something that Brad mentioned, which was treatment tests or smaller scale tests we might do during the response, and in this case, monitor it afterward as well to see what kind of some of the longer term outcomes were. So, and kind of what I want to address in this presentation is, did shoreline cleanup treatments in these heavily oiled marsh environments, did they improve the marsh oiling conditions? Did they aid ecological recovery versus no treatment, doing nothing, also called natural recovery? And as a follow-up to that, we also did some tests with vegetation planting afterwards. I want to kind of see what those outcomes were like. Did those also improve conditions even further? And the big picture question with this type of thing is, did we do it right this time? Would we do something different next time? What would we do faced with similar situation or some modification of that in the future? And then what kind of challenges do we see ahead for some of these types of treatments and concerns, for future responses? So I'll take you back to 2010, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and the area I'm going to focus on is in Louisiana and in Barataria Bay. And you'll see here Barataria Bay on the map. These are a bunch of different sources all combined together for the NERDA case for shoreline oiling conditions. So it's the shoreline cleanup assessment technique surveys, NERDA surveys, aerial photography, satellite images, etc. And you'll see a lot of this blue is no oil observed, but up here in the upper part or northern part of Barataria Bay, you see a lot of those hot colors. That's where there was a lot of heavy oiling. We'll kind of zoom in on that area. And everything in red here on the map were areas where there was, really quite severe oiling conditions. And all these areas were potential areas that required cleanup treatment. I'll show you what that looked like on the ground. So this is in June 2010 as the oil was coming ashore. So it's emulsified, or we call it mousse, coming ashore, coating the vegetation, pretty heavy conditions, but, we couldn't there was some passive cleanup going on during this case, use of booms, in some cases, uses of low pressure flushing, but, what else was going on at this time? So we didn't have source control yet, right? So the well was still moving, additional oil was possibly still coming ashore. And we were kind of drawing short of doing those detailed cleanup plans and moving in with aggressive treatment at this stage, because basically with marshes being a sensitive environment, you only really get a chance to go in and do something once. You couldn't go in and clean this area real intensively and then have it get oiled again. That would just compound the impacts. You can't keep going back. So there was a bit of a waiting period. And as we got through that on into July, August, early September, this is more like what the conditions look like at that point. And at this point, we're getting out, we're doing the detailed shoreline surveys, we're doing the more detailed cleanup plans for kind of final cleanup endpoints. We're mobilizing crews to the areas. And you can see on the top right, kind of shows what ground conditions look like. So that's a heavily oiled vegetation mat. The vegetation was so oiled that it laid over under the weight of the oil and started to weather and harden up and kind of form almost like a cap or a mat over the sediment surface. And the difficult thing, which you couldn't see just doing a quick drive-by or with aerial photography or anything else until you actually got on the marsh, was what was underneath. And this picture shows that. So if you were to cut through or dig up the oil vegetation mat underneath here, you see a zone of about an inch, 2 to 3 centimeters or so of thick emulsified oil on the sediment surface. And a lot of those areas that were shown in red on the previous map that I talked about as potential cleanup targets, they had oiling conditions like this. Heavily oiled surface vegetation, the vegetation was dead, it was laid over, oil trapped on the sediment surface beneath, and at least about 1 centimeter thick in a lot of cases. And just for comparison, this is one of our reference areas from that same time period. Just compare the two. This is what a marsh is supposed to look like, right? And this one even had a little bit of light oiling. It wasn't completely free of oil, but much different conditions. So at this point, some of the traditional cleanup methods were used. Passive use of sorbents, low pressure flushing. Some other things were considered because the marsh was mostly dead. Some people were looking at using vegetation cutting to remove that oil vegetation. There were some vacuum teams out there trying to do vacuum oil up off the marsh surface. None of that was really working. So the next step we decided to go to, and this is part of the NOAA Scientific Support Team and also part of the SCAT program, or Shoreline Cleanup Assessment Technique. We decided to set up a shoreline cleanup treatment testing program in these marsh areas. And this is one of those particular shorelines where we had pretty consistent oiling conditions. It seemed like a good study site because there wasn't a lot of variation in the oiling, so we could kind of have some controls there on oiling variability. And this just shows a kind of quick overflight of that being set up early on, what it looked like at ground level. And we tested numerous things here, including some of the traditional techniques that looked like they weren't working, just so we could look at them under this more controlled environment and compare them to some alternative treatments that we looked at. After trying various things, combinations of treatments, for instance, things as different or alternative as surface raking of the mat, followed by the application of surface washing agents of different types, followed by low pressure flushing. These things they weren't working. There's too much oil, the oil's weathered in place. We even looked at some tailgate tests of burning. Nothing was really appropriate. And what we finally came to through this treatment testing process was a manual treatment sequence where we got crews in on walkboards so they weren't disturbing the marsh soils, raked up the mat, broke the mats up, removed the loose rack material, and removed whatever came up when we did the raking. And we tried to kind of carefully rake down into that oiled mousse layer on the sediment surface, not going into the sediments, but just into that thick mousse layer. Spread that up on the dead standing vegetation, use it as a natural sorbent, and then come around with a new tool, basically hedge trimmer on a pole, to then cut that material out and remove it and dispose of it. And the idea wasn't to remove all the oil, but it was to remove as much gross oiling as we can, and then allow what remained in the marsh to be exposed to sunlight, waves, tides, exposed to the weathering and degradation processes that would help break down that oil over a longer time. And what we see in the bottom right is a shot of what it looked like after the treatment. So we tried not to remove the marsh substrate itself. That was one of the big factors. And this worked in the treatment setting pretty well. We also monitored it over a few weeks to see how it was doing. And at the same time, we're working on scaling this up to operational scale or response scale so it could be applied more widely. And it was applied more widely over a lot of those red areas I showed you on one of the first maps. And we continued to monitor that over time in the treatment plots, kind of using that as an adaptive process where we can learn more about what's happening, how effective it was, if there were any side effects, so that we can then update our response methods as we went forward. Now, another thing that happened after we started the manual treatments on a wider scale is operations thought about, could we scale this up? Could we mimic those manual methods with mechanical equipment, make it more efficient, cover area more quickly, and also put less people in the marsh, less foot traffic in the marsh? Although we're on walkboards, that's a slow process. Could we do it with less boots on the ground, essentially? And so various things were tested, briefly in our test plots where we had areas remaining. And then this was scaled up as well. And it included things like grapplers, rakes, cutting devices, all on hydraulic arms, either operated off of shallow draft barges or larger airboats that could get into some of these shallower areas. And I'll come back to this a little bit, but one of the take homes was certain things like this grappler worked really well for removing oiled rack, also for handling the waste stream once a lot of the raking and cutting was done. Other things like some of the scraping, squeegee devices, some of the cutting and raking got to be a bit too aggressive, and I'll come back to that. Also, in our treatment test area, these methods were applied operationally for that entire shoreline segment outside of and around all the test plots. So what do we do at that point? let's get some more monitoring plots going. We established similar monitoring plots on top of those operationally treated mechanical areas on that same shoreline, so we could also track that over time and how that changed. And the last thing that happened is we were contacted by a graduate student from Tulane University who was interested in marsh restoration and marsh planting after an oil spill, and if that would improve things further. So her name was Brittany Burnick, and she, dissertation student, and she got in touch with us and basically working with us, the SCAT program and the environmental unit and the rest of the response, got permission to set up some of these planting studies in our same area. And it was pretty low tech. Bunch of grad students, or a few grad students actually, planting bare root sparsitinus stems directly into some of these mechanically treated areas, and at a pretty low density. It looked like this, and to be honest, this was kind of mocked and laughed at a little bit across the response. We're like, that'll never work. The next storm, all that'll wash away. The oil's going to kill it. It's not going to survive. Stupid idea, but that's what nerdy scientists do, right? So we'll come back to that. And I also mentioned that LSU, Irv Mendelson's lab, was also really involved in some of this, especially at the earlier treatment test scale. We were almost using him as a sounding board, talking to him about some things early on before some of the damage assessment case really got going, and just getting some feedback. Do you think this will work? What do you think about this? Is it too aggressive? And he just had a lot of research experience with oiled marshes, and that was another good kind of exchange between academia and the response, in addition to Tulane. LSU also did, different parts of LSU and others also did a lot of after the fact sampling in our treatment test area as a part of a whole bunch of different Gomery studies over time. So we had quite a lot of interest in this area with time. So this slide kind of sums up some of the early results. This is just through 2002. On the top left is one of our reference plots. On the top right is one of our manual treatment plots. So pretty good results there compared to what things looked like originally. Bottom left is a no treatment set aside area, or an oiled control. These are really important so you can compare your treatment results against what would happen if you didn't treat, both for effectiveness, but also for possible side effects or negative effects that could be caused by the response itself. But you can see here, a lot of oil still on the surface, not really much different than those early conditions I showed you in fall of 2010. And the vegetation coming in here, at least in this photo, is not spartina. I think this is actually testiculus or saltgrass. And you can see it doesn't look very green and vibrant. Pretty stressed vegetation in that case. And then on the bottom right, here's our mechanical treated areas. But we're showing two options here, two varieties of what happened, planted and not planted. In the foreground are the not planted plot, and right behind that is a planted area. And look at the difference there. So one thing that happened, and I alluded to this, the mechanical, in many cases, or in some cases at least, was too aggressive. We were removing some of the marsh soils, lowering that elevation, and leading to some negative effects. Now, on this particular shoreline, we were able to show pretty effectively that oiling alone, coupled with the vegetation impacts from oiling, accelerated the erosion rate on that marsh by about 2 to 3 times background levels. When we added manual treatment on that, we didn't do any worse. It didn't accelerate any further, and with time, the vegetation redeveloping probably slowed it, but initially it really didn't. It was about the same as oil conditions, but at least we didn't do any further harm, and we jump-started the recovery process, as you can see by the vegetation there. In the manual case, the mechanical treatment alone without planting actually accelerated the marsh erosion by about 4 to 5 times background level. So there's the impact of the oiling, then also a negative impact of the treatment that worsened marsh erosion. However, when we planted, once those plants established and the shoreline reached that level where we had planted to, the edge of the planting plots, that erosion was set back to baseline levels. So a really positive result there. Even though the treatment was too aggressive, planting kind of offset that. So, and then we thought, okay, well, let's track this longer term. We had to make some decisions about what we're going to track over longer term. We thought, well, let's look at the, we've tracked these testing areas for a while. Let's track the operational areas, and let's compare the oiled sites with and without planting over a longer time frame, and also compare those to the oil controls or the no treatment plots, and also reference conditions, and see kind of where we end up. And I'll kind of focus the next few slides on that. This is just really a transition slide for me. This is kind of a reminder of what happened when we didn't treat. This was as late as fall of 2016 in an area that wasn't treated. There's still a lot of oil there, pretty thick, not good conditions, and you don't see much vegetation. It wasn't all this bad, but it was often this bad in many places. So I'll only show you a couple data slides, especially since it's right after lunch. But they're all set up the same way. Each big panel is a year going over time. And then within each panel, we've got reference, oil control or not treated, mechanical treatment only, and then mechanical treatment coupled with planting. And NOO there stands for no oil observed. So our reference sites had no oil observed at this point. So the treatment itself improved the oiling conditions, especially early on. You got to remember the couple years before this, we were also tracking treatment and big differences in oiling conditions when you treat it. And this is really a simple oiling metric, one of several we looked at. This is just the amount of surface oil cover, percent cover on the marsh surface, on the sediments. So you track that over time, oil kind of decreases over time, but still, in all cases where you did the treatment plus the planting, you improved the oiling conditions quite a bit. And I'm not going to go too much into what some of those mechanisms might be just for time's sakes, but maybe we'll get to touch on that some in the question and answer session. So just back to planting, everyone said, oh, that planting won't work. This is a planting area just 2 years later. Compare that to what it looked like pre-treatment. And it really looked pretty good after even 1 year. So last data slide, this is just one of several vegetation metrics we looked at. This is Spartina alterniflora, the dominant plant in these salt marshes. And again, look at some of the differences. Maybe treatment improved things a little bit, but treatment with planting really got us back to reference conditions pretty quickly. It's a pretty good result there over a pretty short amount of time. And this is just kind of a photo summary of that. In the foreground is oil control, no treatment. This is vegetated, but this is not Spartina. This is actually paspalum, not a typical species you'd see in a salt marsh, but it is kind of a weedy, disturbance-tolerant species. Mechanical treatment, same thing. Paspalum dominated in this case. You see the erosion out in front of it, but planted in the background. Same mechanical treatment, but with immediate planting thereafter, that looks more like what a salt marsh should look like. So kind of summing things up, going back to my original questions, did shoreline treatment improve oiling conditions and overall recovery? Yeah, especially over the first few years, but with some negative side effects, right? We got too aggressive with the mechanical treatment, actually worsened the erosion problem. Did planting help even more? I think absolutely, yeah. I think we really showed that to a large degree, especially for vegetation recovery. I didn't show you any of the data we had on marsh fauna and invertebrates and things, but they were a bit slower to recover and had not recovered over the time period I've showed in these slides so far. But they were still improved, and really there were no downsides to planting that we could detect. So what would we do next time in a similar situation? The key here is, or our recommendation going forward would be to carefully tailor both the treatment type and the intensity to your oiling conditions and your habitat types, and follow immediately with planting. And what would that mean in this case? Hindsight, what I would have recommended overall, stick with those manual treatments and then plant immediately after that. That I think would have had the best outcome. So, challenges looking forward. Again, I want to emphasize this: determining the best treatment type and intensity, and holding back where appropriate. And for a lot of oil marshes, this could mean doing nothing. No treatment is often pretty effective unless you've got really severe oiling conditions, like we're seeing here. You often get better results with no treatment, especially under light to moderate oiling conditions. So don't be afraid to hold back, and always keep that in the back of your mind. You don't want to do additional harm. Finding a fit for planting, either under the emergency response or under NERDA or emergency restoration, is tough. What happened during deep water? Everything I've showed you so far was scaled up and used operationally, except planting. And we got in a situation where the response said, well, planting, that's restoration, that's in NERDA's area. They handle that. We talked to the NERDA teams, and I was a member of both of these teams. Talked to the NERDA teams, they said, no, there's still a lot of oil there. This is still in the operational cleanup phase. Response should be, response for that. So what happened? Everyone's doing this, so nothing happened, right? Much later on, state of Louisiana took it on themselves outside the response to actually do some planting, but it was kind of too little too late. By the time they got it all together, much of that erosion had already occurred, and in some cases they'd even eroded back through the oiled zone. And in addition, the planting methods maybe in that case were a little bit different than the bare root planting that we did experimentally. They didn't survive quite as well. So that kind of leads us to, to some further questions that someone could look at. But third point for challenges, establishing set-asides or oil controls. It's really difficult to do during a response. The government and the RP are both really concerned about leaving oil in the environment. But there's really no way to tell if your treatment is all that effective in a situation like marshes or mangroves where you're not going to remove all the oil if you don't have something to compare to. So those set-asides are really important. And lastly, there's a lot of new questions that we're starting to look at now with best planting methods and materials, and maybe if we have time, we'll touch on that during the Q&A. Thanks.